Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. Today we have a first for the podcast. I don't know the name of the person I am interviewing. I only have her pseudonym, Person Irresponsible. All will become clear in due course, but Person Irresponsible is here to talk about what I consider to be the mother of all midlife challenges, walking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada, and her experience of being an alcoholic. Welcome, Person Irresponsible.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's great to be here. And most people call me PI because it's just a little less of a mouthful.
All right, I'll try and call you PI. It sounds a bit weird to me, like PI. And so I could think of all sorts of naughty things it could be instead of Person Irresponsible.
Well, it probably covers all of them anyway, you know.
So the first question has to be, why are you here incognito?
Well, I think you've already nailed it. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I'm very open on a one-to-one basis that I'm a recovering alcoholic. But I also use Alcoholics Anonymous to maintain my sobriety. And part of their traditions is that you don't talk about yourself. You don't sort of talk about yourself at the level of press, radio and film using your real name or your full name or so on and so forth. So it's really out of respect for the organisation that has utterly and totally changed my life for the better. And just to clarify what I mean about an alcoholic, because it's really important, especially right now as we're in lockdown or semi-lockdown, post-lockdown, whatever you want to call it, that alcohol drinking rates have absolutely ballooned in the last sort of 2 years. And the biggest group and the most worrying group of alcoholic drinkers right now are women aged 40 and 60. And it's, my drinking wasn't the stereotype. Most women's drinking isn't the stereotype of living on a park bench, drinking around the clock, vodka out of a brown paper bag. We're not like that. That's not how we are. Our drinking tends to be more home-based. It tends to be more of the binge variety, so 1+ bottles a night. And it tends to be several nights a week, not necessarily 7, but it'd be more a case of, I didn't drink on Thursday, go me. So it's really sort of, I'm very willing and happy to talk about my own drinking career and such like and what it did and didn't do for me. But it's more important to me that we just start getting honest about what women's drinking is really like right now, and it's an epidemic. And alcohol admission rates are skyrocketing in hospitals, and the number of people with terminal and chronic liver conditions is just horrific right now, and it's not being particularly well talked about. We are in dry January, so we might as well get talking about that too.
We might not be in dry January by the time this gets published, but yes, absolutely. And I am doing dry
once a year.
I'm doing dry January, and we've talked on this podcast before about emotional drinking and eating, but we've never actually talked about alcoholism. And I've also been honest in the past on podcasts about the fact that sometimes I drink too much. I know I drink too much. And I talk a lot about alcohol in the context of menopause, because when we start going through menopause, alcohol is not our friend. And we think it is. And we think that our body can continue to process alcohol in the same way that it always did. And it can't. And getting hot flashes because you have a drink is the body's way of telling us something has to change. And yet I know that there are a lot of women out there, and excuse listeners if you've heard me on this particular soapbox before, but there are a lot of women who will take the drugs, they will take the HRT and carry on drinking too much. And That's not a good scenario, but they managed to control their symptoms with the HRT rather than dealing with the underlying issues of perhaps drinking a bit too much. So, I'm very glad that you're here and you're open and willing to talk about that. So let's talk a little bit. I was going to talk about the trail and come back to this later, but you've started it here. So let's talk about, when do you think that drinking turns into alcoholism?
Oh, I wish I could answer that really succinctly. I think alcoholism, and I think for all of us that say we're alcoholic, it's such a personal. It's the only time we use it is when we've ironically stopped drinking. No one calls themselves an alcoholic until they have stopped, and it's such a dirty, horrible, tragic word. So for me, it was just a case of once I went to AA, and the significant reason I went to AA was not because I thought I was an alcoholic. It was because I thought they would be experts in helping me complete a dry January, and albeit I was doing it in February because it's just short a month, don't you know? Yeah. And it was so much more attainable. So I knew I was drinking too much, and I knew that, I kept, like you say, emotional drinking. No matter what was happening, I was just thinking of drinking all the time and wanting to drink all the time. So it was more of a sense of, I learned to say, my name's P.I., I am an alcoholic, because that's the tradition of the rooms. And so it took me quite a long time to get comfortable with the term, and the more you use something, the more it becomes less threatening and less sort of embarrassing and shameful over time. So I don't know when each individual line is crossed. I tend to think of it more of a sort of a progressive journey, if you like. I hate the phrase, but where you go through certain non-returnable gates. So we all have all these rules and regulations and things we'll never do. And then you just do it the once and you think, well, I won't do that again. But now you've done it once, you will do it again. And so it gets gradually and slowly worse over time. But you don't really realise that. And, if at all, most of us don't realise it. And that's the sad truth. So certain things, like I never drank in the morning. I always said, if you drink in the morning, you're an alcoholic. If you drink after 6 o'clock, you're respectable. So I never drank before 6. What I do know, though, is right towards the end of my drinking, that I'd be pacing the corridor of my flat in Edinburgh, thinking, God, why is it not 6 o'clock yet? Wanting time to fast forward so that I could drink respectably after 6 o'clock. So those, more for me, it's not so much as a big thick black line that you cross. It's more of you change your rules and you change what's acceptable to you, and you don't realise that you're slowly changing your drinking patterns from what for me used to be a weekend gig and eventually ended up being a 4, 5, 6 night a week gig.
It's interesting for me because I've always tried to do dry January, and I also will often do Stoptober. And once I think the first time I did dry January, I wrote a blog post, and I wrote in it that I was really pleased that I'd managed to achieve it because that proved I wasn't an alcoholic. And somebody commented and said, "No, it doesn't." And I thought, that's really interesting. But there's me, saying, I can do dry January. I'm not an alcoholic.
Well, I hung on to that belief for a long time. I jet skied around the UK, or attempted to. I should qualify this. And it was a decision I'd made to do whilst drinking, which kind of sort of shows you how my thinking goes when I'm drunk. And anyway, I ended up doing it, and I ended up jet skiing, and I started just north of the Thames, and I went anti-clockwise round, and somewhere around, I was in Scotland, and I was about 10 days into my trip, and someone had brought me a bottle of Beck's. Now, Beck's is the only beer at the time that was suitable for vegetarians, and so I remember looking at this bottle, and I am vegetarian. I looked at this bottle of Beck's, and I remember thinking, I can't drink this. I just cannot drink this. I'm so physically battered by what I'm doing. See, proves you don't have a problem with drinking. And it was just that, just the fact that I had to jet ski to actually intercept my drinking. Anyway, I didn't drink for 3 weeks. And, and I hung on for that for years, going, I didn't drink for 3 weeks, so I don't have a problem with the booze. I now know if I'm looking for reasons to prove a not, it's a good indicator that I am. So I'm afraid having a few weeks off, I know a good friend of mine who had chemotherapy for a year for breast cancer, which is the number one cause is alcohol. And she said, well, I didn't drink for that whole year I had chemotherapy, so I can't have a problem. And it's like, well, it doesn't work like that. We can all have chemotherapy if it stops us drinking, but it's a kind of extreme way of stopping drinking if you're honest about it.
Most women can stop drinking when they're pregnant.
Exactly that. And again, it's changing over time. So most of us will find that as we age, our tolerance and our ability to withstand booze changes, and that we're more likely to get addictive as our bodies change as well. So it's not a case of, I can no more go back to my early 20s physically and then I can resume my early 20s drinking. Unfortunately, that's the sad truth. All of us want to be able to control our drinking better. All of us want to be able to drink a small amount without it becoming chaos. That's a common theme. So whether, I went to AA quite simply because it's free. It's not government regulated. There's no forms to fill in. You can say your name's Mary Poppins. No one's going to batter an eyelid. Other recovery systems, other stop drinking systems are available, but you may need to actually tell someone that, and fill in a form and declare it to your doctor, and that can be very, very off-putting because there's still a lot of shame around drinking. And if you've still got young children at home, that's a real barrier, because everybody thinks if I tell my doctor I've got a drinking problem or I'm worried about my drinking, the next thing is social services are going to turn up with lights blaring and let the neighbours know. And so there's a real barrier being a woman getting help, and that for me is why AA was very, very attractive.
Such a minefield, isn't it? It really is. And you're right, with COVID, I can completely understand that drinking's gone up. My own personal drinking has gone up. I know that. Mm-hmm. So we have to, I think, find better ways to manage our emotions, manage our stress, don't we? Particularly for women, because I think, alcohol is dangerous for everybody. But as you've just said, alcohol is the major cause of breast cancer. And I think because of our hormones, alcohol is particularly dangerous for women. And we don't want to accept that, do we? We want to just,
we've just
carry
been
on
through,
as we have.
Just been through December, and every single advert tells me that, every second advert's about alcohol anyway, and every single advert works on the following three themes. It'll make me sexier, it'll make me more sophisticated, and it'll make me smarter. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. You put alcohol in me, and believe you me, I am not sexy. Anything that comes out of my mouth may or may not be accurate, and I am certainly not smart. So yeah, So we do have a real love of alcohol generally in this country. We tend to be one of the higher drinking countries, globally. We do worship it, and it's only when you stop drinking that you realise actually, TV-wise, or social media-wise, we're saturated in the stuff, and it can be quite tough thinking that, that gives you that feeling of FOMO, fear of missing out. If I'm not drinking, I'm not going to have any friends, and I'm not going to be able to go to parties, and I'm not going to be able to do this. And clearly that's not true, but at the time, that's what I really believed.
But that is, it is partly true, because if you're not drinking, you then have to explain yourself, don't you?
Less so than you think. Less so. Very rarely somebody will say to me, "Oh, you don't drink, do you?" Now, obviously, because I've written a book and people know I've written a book, they now know I am the village drunk, So until that, I daren't sit on the park bench because it's like, they'll all be talking about me. But it's generally not. And generally, I've learnt to deal with it anyway. I've got three ways of dealing with it. One is I don't look like an alcoholic. I'm no one stereotype of what an alcoholic looks like. So I will generally look them straight in the eye and they go, "Yeah, it's because I'm a raving alcoholic," and they think that's hilarious because they can't put the two ideas together. I'm telling the truth. They don't know that. They don't need to know that. Simply, it's none of their business. The other thing I say to people is that I'm allergic to alcohol. AA actually uses the term allergy to talk about that reaction of one glass is never enough, but nor is 1,000. And they just call that reaction an allergy. So I'll sometimes say to people, "Oh, I'm allergic to alcohol," and they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And you think, yeah, not as much as me, So that's another way of dealing with it. And sometimes I just say, no, I just don't drink. I had a problem with drinking. I drank my lifetime's allowance of drinking, and I drank his, and I drank hers, and I drank yours, and I'm really sorry about that. And so therefore, it's best I don't drink now. And people are fine with that. Generally, what happens when you do tell people you've had a problem with alcohol is it turns you into a Catholic priest, and then they confess theirs. And there's nothing more boring than listening to somebody going, "I had too many sherries on Sunday," and you're like, "Right, I bought a jet ski when drunk. Compare notes on that one," So so it, each to their own. But I'm we need to start talking about life without alcohol and life because it's on trend right now, just like veganuary is, non-drinking and all these alcohol-free stuff is coming along. So there is a trend going in that direction. So perhaps we need to get past the fear of being labelled an alcoholic. Worse things can happen.
But for somebody like me who definitely doesn't want to go there just yet, if I'm out for a meal, there have been occasions where, people have said, oh, you're no fun because you're not drinking. And that's simply that. I would love to change that. I mean, there's lots of narratives that I'm trying to change about midlife and aging and women getting older, etc., etc. But that narrative
can I suggest that you ring them first thing in the morning and go, oh, you're no fun because you don't want to get out of bed right now.
That's a good one. I like that. But I like that allergic as well. I think increasingly what I say is I'm just taking a break. Taking a break. And actually that people can respect that, because I think, as you said, if they do think you're no fun when you're not drinking, it's probably because they have a bit of problem themselves with the alcohol.
Absolutely. And no one wants someone to make them feel uncomfortable about it. So yeah, but it goes back to why we need to have that conversation, that if we're not prepared to have those awkward conversations, we're all going to stay in denial and we're all going to carry on with the bad habits. So
yeah. Well, I think we could spend the whole podcast talking about this, but you did something pretty amazing.
Thank you.
And I would love to talk about that, because she has a book out, PI has a book out, and it's called Everything You Ever Taught Me. And I wondered who the you is.
The you is everybody that lives in my head. I don't think I'm alone with having an awful lot of voices in my head that really are quite self-destructive. So as I said in my book, I feel like I know you better if I've never met you. So I always imagine people saying this and that. And it's a bit like worrying about, if I put down the drink, then they will say, well, who's they? And actually it's the voices in our head making us more vulnerable. So it's all the people that you meet in life, the vast majority will show you something about themselves that either you will love or loathe. So the you can be anything you want it to be. But I've spent my entire life living with anxiety, which just means I obsess with what people obsess about. And I'm constantly worried about what people might think of me or what people might say. And that is anxiety in a nutshell. So the you can be all of these voices in my head that sort of suggest that I'm not good enough, or that if I did this, I'd be better as a person, or I'm a bad person. So it's those, and when you go on a long distance hike, the only thing you can take with you that you can't get rid of is your head. And so this head bounds along, and I was, in my 40s, I was in my 4th year of recovery, I was fat. I don't walk anywhere, I'm not a fit person at all. And so, I've got all these head demons to take with me, and one by one over 6 months, you start to engage, or I started to engage with them and started to realise that actually that's probably the most self-destructive part of me, more so than anything else. And it's probably why I took to drinking so nicely to begin with. And spoiler alert, it's only when I get towards the end and someone asked me a very serious question about hiking, and my immediate reaction was, well, don't ask me, I know nothing. And they just looked at me and said, you know everything. You've just lived in the wilderness for over 5 months. You've walked all this way. You're allowed an opinion. And I suddenly realised, this imposter syndrome that has crippled me my entire life is still raging away, and I'm still blind to it, So it was you was whoever you want it to be, but all of those head demons that I carry around, and all of those reasons why I find it so difficult sometimes to just manage life.
But they also taught you things, because that's everything you ever taught me. Everything the voices taught you.
But also the people that you meet along the way. There was people that I met along the way, and they taught me about some of my own, behaviours, that I too quickly fall in line with what other people want. And actually that might not be in my best interest, especially if they've got their own agendas that are counter to mine. So one of the popular thru-hiking phrases is hike your own hike. But of course that actually means going off and doing this on your own. That means walking away from the herd. And that in itself is terrifying. As women, we're always told we've got this additional danger to face that men don't face, which is being a woman on your own. So there's all those things that you have to tackle everything that life throws you. And I had to walk away from, from my family, family as they call it, because one of them knew they didn't have enough money to go, and she didn't have enough physicality to get up the hills. The other one had sort of raging drug problem, and so that kept taking her off, and she didn't have the physicality either. So it was like, but when I said to them, like, I've got to start walking now because I'm falling so far behind, and the histrionics of that, and the temper tantrums of other people, and it's like, well, it is really tough as an individual to say, I'm going on my own, because then the head demons say, yeah, but you're not a team player, are you? You don't know how to look after other people. So everything that I do is always got this but going on. So even when I'm doing the right thing, my head's telling me I'm doing the wrong thing, and so on. So that, those are the sort of instances that that I learned from interacting with other people and how they were coping with it.
You did get a little cheer from me when you decided you were not going to get up at like 11 o'clock in the morning, set off at 11 o'clock in the morning, that you wanted to get up early. And then you met some more people and they were getting up at 4 in the morning, weren't they? It was like, okay, we've gone from one extreme to the other.
And that is the story of my life. But I mean, again, because I met them, they pushed me beyond what I was comfortable with. And I loved it and I loathed it. But, but again, I was learning that actually I am better than I think I am. And I can push further than I think I can. But I needed those people to sort of pull me along a little bit. And then, so it was a lot of the trek is actually who you meet along the way. And because the pandemic was on, I was on my own 70% of the time. Nights especially, was probably about 70% of my nights slept alone in the wilderness. And I am not someone who sleeps well alone in the wilderness. It was quite terrifying. Because my head's telling me I'm going to get eaten alive by a bear, I'm going to get devoured by a rattlesnake. It's just all constant and chronic. So it was quite the adventure. Yeah.
I didn't realise it was as much as that, 70% of the time that you were sleeping alone. Wow. Gosh, because I didn't get that impression. Wow. Whew. And that's super scary. And I understand that. Yeah, it's not just the bears and the rattlesnakes. It's also other people and what they might do to you. And we have to have that level of awareness, don't we? But I mean, I was taught... my mum does not like me going down the little track next to the golf course next to her house. And I'm like, Mum, it's fine. But she, I was taught to always be careful. And I'm like, I'm 55 now, I'll be fine. It's okay.
Well, I mean, I even had hitchhiking is a big part of being a thru-hiker, because obviously you've got to go to towns to get your supply. And I mean, I was stood trying to hitch a lift to get back to the trail. And a car pulls up and this man gets out and he says, oh, you've got to keep an eye out for the white truck. He's murdered 3 women this year. And then he gets in his car and he drives off. And it was like, blimey, I'm in the middle of bloody this, little tiny town in America. And I'm still being warned about don't be a woman on your own. It's too dangerous, And it's just, it comes a point that you realise that actually that's other people's fears. And I have to just get on with my day and I have to do what I need to do in order to complete my thru-hike. So yeah, but again, when I came back to the UK and I'd applied for a job and this guy had said, well, it involves going into people's houses, and as a woman, how do you feel about that? And all I could think about was, well, isn't that what district nurses do? And they're largely women, or historically have been women. Isn't that what care assistants do? Why are we worrying about this? Why are you targeting me as a woman? Do you ask that question to men? So it's one of those things that I realised, that gender as a woman, I'm given extra kudos for doing this over a man, but I'm also constantly reminded that I'm more frail and more vulnerable, and that holds us back. And that's why really it was only when the film Wild came out, and she'd walked it in the 1990s, she'd walked about 1,000 miles of the trail in the 1990s. And I think, it was made into a film because she was a woman. I don't think it would have had the same impact if it was a man. So we've got this sort of duality of, we're given more kudos, but we're also deterred from it. But that particular film meant that thru-hiking went from being sort of 80% men, 20% women, or, around about that number. It's now about 40-60, so 40% women, 60% men. So it has had an impact on allowing women to go, free roaming and doing more things on their own, which, we wouldn't have done in the 1990s to such an extent.
Gosh, no, I can't even imagine it, actually. I can't imagine it as a possibility. But I just wanted to explain to listeners that you talk about the thru-hike, because there are sections that people just go hiking on sections, and through a thru-hiker, which is what you were, means you're going from one end of the trail to the other end of the trail, isn't
That's
it?
it. And this particular trail is officially the world's longest, so it was 2,653. Now, there are other trails
Bloody
that are...
hell.
No, there are other trails that are longer, but they're not one continuous trail, for example. So they may be several trails interlinked, and there may be some road walking in between. But the Pacific Crest Trail is specifically one long continuous trail. So in theory, you can't get lost. In reality, I got lost loads.
So why did you decide to do this crazy thing?
I don't know. I wish I could honestly. I've never come up with a really pithy reason for doing it beyond the fact that a friend had seen Wild. She was like, "You have to do this. You have to watch this film," and I was like, "I don't." And it really all started then. And then all of the obstacles you think that you might encounter just fell away, and all of a sudden it was like, well, I can do this. And it was just so much as it just felt like the right thing to do. And you can only get a permit. I didn't even know this at the time. You can only get a permit, and there's only sort of one day a year that you can get a permit to do it. And I happened to discover this fact on the very day of permit day. And because America's behind time wise, it was 6 o'clock our time in the UK that you could apply for the permit. And it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had to race upstairs, all fat and naked, and get on my computer and do all these pre-courses before you could apply, and then I got one of the lucky tickets, and most people don't get a ticket, or a permit. So it was just little things like that was just like, blimey, I've suddenly got this permit to do something, and I'm going to go and do it, and then of course you've got 6 months to absolutely wet yourself just thinking of everything that can go wrong, and that's what happened really. And it was hard, and it was like I say, very lonely because of the pandemic. Everybody buggered off, so very few of us are actually out in the wilderness. But it felt like at the time, it felt like the safest place to be. So I just stayed out, which gave it a very unique experience, because normally about 3,000 people have a go every year, and about 600 to 800 actually make it. And this, in 2020, there was probably about 100 of us that actually made it. And really not, most people left within the first few weeks. So yeah, very unique, very novel way of experiencing the pandemic. So of course, when I did come into town to get my resupply, and I'd log on and read the news, it was for months I couldn't understand what all the fuss was about, because it was like, well, 12 people have died, and you're like, but I'm in a population of 360 million. Why is this headline news? So it was very, very strange. And you got the culture shock of coming into town and having lived in the wilderness and life being incredibly slow, and then suddenly you're in a town largely empty because the traffic's not there. But then everyone's wearing knickers on their faces, and you're like, well, what the hell is going on here? Everyone looks like they're about to rob a bank. So very novel way of experiencing the pandemic.
But the official guidance was actually that you shouldn't have been carrying on, wasn't it? So
yeah, absolutely.
Why did you decide to keep going?
It was rock and a hard place. It really was it was the toughest decision I had to make on trail. One, genuinely believed it was all going to be over fairly quickly. We live in a very hyped up world, and I've travelled the world, so I've lived in very dangerous situations. So perhaps partly that's because that's my comfort zone. So I tend not to get too stressed when things are chaotic. And also, I'm the adult child of an alcoholic home, so I'm used to chaos. It's innate in me. It's where I thrive. And I now know that about myself because of getting into recovery. So part of me was like sort of playing it down and not realising how serious this was at all. And I think a lot of people at that time, I don't think that was particularly unusual. I think there was very quickly, we divided into two camps. And then also, I lived in a rented place, and so I'd given up my place. I'd put everything into storage. So even if I had come back to the UK, I had nowhere to go, and I'm sure somebody somewhere could have given me, a spare bedroom. But it was like, well, but then what? Then what? So it just seemed to me like, well, it's going to be over fairly quickly. This is going to be over in a few months. I'll just carry on and see where it takes me. And then obviously within a few months, about 3 months into the trek, obviously restrictions started to ease in California, but it was a case of, I just took it literally as I'd been shown to do it in sobriety, which was, let's just take this day by day. And if they kick you out of the country, then that's okay. That's out of my control. But for now, they're not. And for now, they know we're here and they're not telling us to leave. So I'll just stay. And like I say, given there's a virus going around, probably the safest place to be was in the wilderness, quite frankly, where you weren't going to meet anybody else. There was the longest I went between meeting people was 4.5 days. And the people that I were meeting were also barely ever having contact with the outside world themselves. So it felt pretty safe out there.
Mm.
But yeah, the guilt kicked in when I came back, and I started getting an appreciation of what the rest of the world had been living through. And 6 months after I came back, I got pretty nasty depression because of the isolation and the loneliness. And so I had a much more, bigger appreciation of what lockdown had done to our mental well-being, for example. Yeah.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually. How do you come home after doing something like that?
Well, the great thing is I had to go into lockdown, into quarantine, my apologies. So I just checked myself, so I've done this amazing thing, but I can't actually see anybody or tell anybody because, besides on social media. So I had to just go and live in a sort of farm cottage for 2 weeks. And then my body froze and I couldn't walk or anything. So, yeah, I 6 months, I was probably the happiest of my life, the most content, the most at ease inside myself. I really felt the most well put together person I'd ever been. And then about 6 months later, like I say, out of nowhere, I got a really vicious sort of debilitating depression. And I've had depression on and off my whole life. But this was particularly grim and particularly nasty. So unfortunately, I had to go back to the doctors, and I was going to go back on antidepressants, but I just started reacting to them. So I ended up not being able to go on antidepressants. But so it was, so 6 months later it was tough. And I do think part of that was the isolation of lockdown. I'm not married and I don't live with anyone bar a cat, and he's pants at conversation after a while, so it was 6 months later it was particularly tough. But I think that's quite common after big life events, whether they're good life events or bad life events. I've had friends that were diagnosed with cancer and their depressions kicked in 6 months later, so it seems to be a fairly patterned thing. So it was tough, and obviously you want to be really proud of yourself, but actually in reality it spared everyone me going, when I was in America every 2 minutes, when I was in America. And also the other good thing was it allowed me to, I couldn't get any work. There was no work to be had. So I was like, well, I might as well just crack on and write this book, that I'd planned on doing every weekend. But actually I was just like, well, I'll just write a book instead. And so it worked out quite well in that respect. It forced me to crack on and do something that I wanted to do.
It is a great book. It's very readable.
Thank you.
It's really interesting, and there's all the different aspects of it, the walk, the you being the Brit in America, the Alcoholics Anonymous, and the journey you've been on with that. It's a very interesting and well put together book. So yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really proud of it. I never saw myself, and these are the joys of sobriety. My drinking, like I say, it never took me to that stereotype that we all have, but it got bad enough that the hangovers, they just made sure that I laid around all day. And then I'd be clock watching till 6 o'clock. And then after that, I'd be drinking. And that really is a really poor quality life. Forget the health aspect. It's not a great quality of life. But at the time, I really believed it was okay. I really believed that was normal. And I didn't realise that actually alcohol self-selected my friends for me. So I was always looking for friends with other big drinkers, which goes back to what you were saying about parties earlier. Whereas now I don't drink, I have more authentic, more genuine friends because I'm sober and I'm there and they're there. And, the vast majority of the friends I've made through AA anyway. So it's given me a whole new way of living. And AA has also taught me how to sort of manage my alcoholism because, well, my anxiety, if you like, because I sort of see the two interchangeable. I drank for a reason. I drank because it changed how I felt. And it always works. If I felt bad, it made me feel less bad. If I was happy, it made me ecstatic. If I was depressed, it made me feel okay, And once that stopped working, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. But what I've learned in sobriety is there's so much to do. Time is the enemy. I can't pack everything I want to get done in because there's only 24 hours in a day. And so it's opened up a whole new portal of life that I never knew existed. I genuinely thought teetotalers were the most boring people in the world, and I couldn't have been more wrong. Or at least certainly, I've got out there and I'm having an amazing time and doing all sorts of things, like writing a book, like walking across America. I would never have predicted either of those things in my life at all, but it's because I'm sober I've managed to do that.
I sort of got to the stage with drinking that I don't have time for a hangover. Not that I ever had really bad hangovers. I've never been a big drinker, but as I said at the beginning, it impacts me much more now than it did when I was younger. I can't, sleep it off, lots of water and feel fine in the morning. It's going to have an impact. And I decided I don't have time for that. I've got too much to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons our drinking's progressed in lockdown, is that if women are having a big sesh the night before, we know that the hair of the dog, works. So that's the one way that you break that barrier of morning drinking. What most women have found, though, that's more typical in men, to be honest. What most women find is, like I'd experienced it, that starting time, the time that we give ourselves permission, it creeps up earlier and earlier. So 6 would have become 5, 5 would have become 4. And that's how it progresses. So it's, like I say, it's this unsighted, very sneaky sort of change in our behaviour. But I agree. I mean, it was the hangovers really that I couldn't handle. If the hangovers weren't as horrific as they were, then I'd still be drinking. I'm quite convinced, because I wouldn't have seen the light. But I got so sick. And again, it's because I'm aging, but I've got this unrealistic expectation that I'm not going to age.
You said about when you were depressed, alcohol made you feel better. But it only does that in the short term, doesn't it? It doesn't do that long term. It can really contribute to melancholy and sadness.
Well, that's it. Depression is living in the wreckage of the future, and it really is seeing the future as being something very doomsday-esque. And so alcohol gives you that reprieve today, which is what you really need. And it takes you away from that fear of the future. But of course, it does, unfortunately. You're borrowing. It's like a payday loan. You're borrowing now, but you've got to pay it back with interest in the future. And depression, unfortunately, is the trading stock. So it does make things a lot worse over time, not better.
So can I ask, when your depression kicked in 6 months after your walk and you didn't go on antidepressants and you didn't have the alcohol, what did you do to get through that?
I did initially go on depression, but then I had all those reactions that are typical. So I went into a sort of stasis where I didn't feel anything, but I wasn't living either. So I had to come off. And then I went on to another set and they gave me chronic migraines. So I came off those as well. So then I went on to anti-anxiety to block the migraines. And that's all I can rely on now. It fortunately, very, very fortunately, is around about that time, more and more meetings started reopening up. So a big part of the AA fellowship is going, you don't have to, but the actual AA program is the 12-step program, which the book actually describes how it taught me a whole new set of life skills that I had not acquired growing up in a dysfunctional household, and being an alcoholic I'd not acquired growing up because I'd always turned to booze. So AA is, those 12-step skills that I've learned are what equips me for life. But at the time that I got really horrific depression, a handful of face-to-face meetings started opening up, and they were confined to the rule of 15 at the time. So a small number of meetings started opening up, which meant I could leave the house again, and all of those things matter. Drinking too much is a disease of isolation, and it isolates you because of A, hangover, and B, because you don't want to make a prat of yourself, and so on and so forth. So having meetings to go to means I'm always seeing friends, I'm always seeing other people, I'm always having that social interaction, which is a great way of combating depression. So it was, like I say, so there was about 3 weeks of really horrific depression, and then was able to find more and more meetings to go to. There is that societal pressure of not going out unnecessarily, but when you're a recovering alcoholic, yes, there's meetings on Zoom as well, but they're not quite, for me, they weren't quite the same. And an awful lot of alcoholics have relapsed, in more so than usual. You know what I mean? We are seeing an awful lot of higher rates of relapse because Zoom is brilliant, but it's not quite the same in terms of the general chit-chat you have before and after a meeting, where you can all sort of, mingle in groups, whereas on Zoom it's going to be one person talking and everyone else listening. So that really helped, was that fellowship aspect coming alive again. And that's so crucial for anyone that's trying to maintain sobriety, because alcohol's always there. It's always going to be the easy option.
I think it's so crucial for mental health generally, and it is known that as we get older, we need that social interaction more and more. And the more isolated we are, the worse it is. We get down. Our mental capacities get less when we are isolated and when we don't interact. So absolutely.
And we know also women are just disproportionately suffering in lockdown because we are less well paid. We're more likely to have jobs that are all the childcare issue with homeschooling has been. So we are double punished for being a woman sometimes, and that's just the way our society is set up. All of those things are going to exacerbate any pre-existing mental health conditions, of which alcoholism is one.
So what were some of the sorts of people that you met on the trail? You've talked about a person who had a drug problem and
that
others.
was the big shock. I didn't. In America, cannabis is legal now in California, Oregon, and Washington. It's not in every state, but in those 3 states it is. And they've repackaged it so it looks like sweets and candy, and it looks really fun, and it's very tempting. But it's like anything else. I was always told, oh, marijuana, you can't get addicted to it. But it's the same as alcohol. Not everybody who drinks will become addicted to it. And marijuana is exactly the same. Not everyone who takes marijuana will become addicted to it. It's one of those that we're not all bodily the same. And that could be quite tough to realise. So that was the biggest shock, was how many drugs there were on the trail. So I met other people. Like I say, I met this couple, and I walked with them for about 10 days. Then there was a very long period of being on my own, where I just met people very, very briefly, like walking in the opposite direction. And like I say, after 4.5 days of walking alone, I was desperate for conversation. I was desperate to see another human being. And this old guy comes along, and he starts talking about his kit, and he starts telling me how awful my kit is and how poor my choices are. And I'm just stood there, my feet are hurting, and I'm thinking, why am I listening to this? So that was one of those realizations that I listened too much without interrupting. And some old men especially have opinions that I really don't need to listen to. And so it was like, I'm going now, my feet hurt, bye. And I remember being so angry because I was so desperate for conversation and so desperate to meet another human being. And then I met this person who I just didn't want to know at all. And so there was quite a long period. And then I got to the Sierra, which is the most dangerous part. And I hooked up with a woman. And she was just miserable. She was just so. I don't know why she was doing it in the end. And I think she quit shortly after we hiked together, because she was just so angry at everything. She was angry at the hills and angry at her equipment, and she was always shouting and screaming. And it was just like, blimey. By then, I'm just starting to really enjoy myself. So I was like, oh no. So that those are those things that I realised that I'd been a very angry person as well. So it was almost like showing me the other side of me. So it was like, right, I'm going to learn to just chill out and not get angry at inanimate objects anymore, because it's really quite off-putting for people around you. So I hiked with her for about a week, and she was lovely. She could be great fun, but she just just had this furious temper to her, and that was quite interesting. And then after that, I hiked with the 4 farters, and it was just, I didn't realise that we all know that if you go on an aeroplane, it makes you quite gassy. Well, it also is to do with the altitude, but I'd never realised by going up over mountains every single day, you're going to have the same impact. And so and you lose all sense of dignity or inhibition, because you're just grim. You don't wear deodorant, you stink like a cave woman. And you just let rip, you learn how to snot rocket. It's just, the whole thing is just undignifying. And so I ended up hanging out with these 4 men for about 4 nights, and they were just farting. They just didn't even apologise. Just noises in every direction. And I was just like, oh, well, I'm just going to join them, So I let out an early morning fart, and it comes out like an advertising jingle. So it's like, I'm dying a million deaths then. And, but it changed. You realise how much of our lives are social niceties, if you like, and decorum. And I, we talked just prior before, I'd gone to this all-girls boarding school, and that had been terribly prissy, and it probably was the worst place to send me, because I'm not remotely prissy. But I realised just how much, social niceties can be very containing and that sort of thing. So so I didn't meet as many people as I thought I would, because obviously of the pandemic. And then towards the end, I hiked with a guy called Jeff, and that's actually his real name. It's one of the only real names in the book. There's 2 real names, and his is one of them. And Jeff actually resides in Washington ordinarily. And so he had all of his friends and family come and visit him on the trail. And because I was hiking with him, they adopted me too. And they were just unbelievable. They were like, right, we're doing your shopping for you, so you don't have to leave the trail. And so I gave them a shopping list, and then they wouldn't take any money. And they brought picnics. So every 4 or 5 days we'd bump into them at like a dirt track. And they'd have this picnic waiting for us with like chocolate and coffee and ice cream and, oh man, pizza. And so that was just unbelievable. unbelievable, and they just wouldn't take any money. So it was just the generosity of, that human kindness, and how much in life is the kindness of strangers that can end up having the most impact, rather than the familiarity of friends. So it was just an incredible experience, and like I say, one I'm thinking of repeating.
I know, you said that before we hit record, and I was like, wow. So tell us, come on, you're thinking of doing it again?
I think because I've lost all the ache and pain of the first one. For 6 months after for a good year, the first year, but particularly 6 months after I returned, I was in so much pain in my feet. And now that's gone. And I had one dead toe that refused to come back to life. All my toenails have regrown. Everything else is fine. My feet had grown a size and a half during the trail, and they've shrunk back down to, they're about half size bigger than they were before I went. So I think everything's sort of snapped back into normality. I've got one slightly dead toe, and I'm now one dress size bigger than I was when I was calling myself fat before I went. So I've ended up carrying on eating and eating and eating and eating. So part of it is like, I really want to be skinny again, because that was great. And I miss it. It's like childbirth. That's why women have 2 children. It's the most horrific thing you can do, giving birth. And then within minutes, you're like, I want to do that again. And I feel like it's a bit like a more long drawn out process, like 6 months of labour. And now, 18 months later, I'm like, I really, really, really want to do this again. And I miss the simplicity. I just miss the sheer vastness of the experience. And so I am thinking of doing it again. It will be a different trail. It'll be more inland. It'll be the Continental Divide Trail, albeit I'm sort of toying with the idea of the Appalachian as well. But that has grizzly bears, so it's even more terrifying. But yeah, I'm very, very tempted. We'll see if I can get a visa. But these things aren't easy right now.
That simplicity really appeals to me. The bit that doesn't appeal to me is having to carry a flipping tent or having to carry everything with you. But there is something very romantic to me, and I've done it. I've traveled before where I've literally just had everything on my bag, and there's a certain simple beauty to that, isn't there? That you have actually everything you need to exist with you.
It's a real reset button in gratitude, because I certainly appreciate stuff now. And actually, when I came back, I got rid of so much more stuff from my house. It's like, if I genuinely have not used this, it's going to the charity shop, it's going in the bin. And so I really, really got rid of so much more stuff, because it's, so it did change a few of my behaviours. And like I say, I still get in a hot bath today and think it's the best invention ever. And a hot chocolate at the end of a walk and all of those things. So yeah, it's hard work, but I always thought it's a bit naff to say these things change you. And I didn't think it had a very profound influence on me for quite a long time. But I remember asking somebody who'd also done it, and she said she realised about 2 or 3 years later that she still had this innate calmness. When other people were getting stressed, she just stood there and going, I'm just going to reason this through. I'm just going to think this through. And I still have that. I just don't have a panic system anymore. I don't have that hyper reaction anymore. Because I lived like that for 6 months, where it was like, okay, the trail has just evaporated in a landslide, and I'm just going to look at it for a while and then navigate my way through it. Well, there's a bear. I'm going to sing now. And so it's just that it has slowed me down inside mentally, and so I do sort of react to things a lot more calmly than I ever thought possible.
I think it's just amazing. I'm in awe of you. I think it's incredible what you've achieved. Really is amazing. And not just 6 months or a year or 2 years later, that this should keep you going for a lifetime, I reckon, because you can always look back and think, bloody hell, look what I did.
And I did it alone. That's the thing that I'm so proud of. Because even though, like I said, 40% of the 60-40 is now the mix, the vast majority of women are still doing it with somebody. So to do it on your own is the real, for me, like that sense of breaking down barriers, where we've been, as we've already said, held back by other people warning us about all these imaginary dangers, and we believe them, and actually our lives are inhibited as a consequence. So no one can ever take away from the fact that once upon a time I walked across America and I absolutely hated every second of it, but I love it now.
Yeah, that's the thing you need to remember when you're planning at the next one. It's like, okay, how long do I have to put up with the hatred for? No, it's amazing.
But it is, like having that 12-step philosophy really helped me understand it is just one day. And a phrase that I picked up in the hiking community is that we always say, don't quit on a bad day. And I actually think that's probably the best life lesson I could take away from that, especially if you're thinking of drinking or stopping drinking. Something is going to happen fairly quickly in your newfound sobriety. For me, it was my little cat dying. And my little cat died and I was only a few months sober. And I remember finding her body and sitting on the wall. And I loved this little cat. She was my absolute life. And thinking, I'm glad I don't have to drink on this. And that was the first time that I realised that AA was working for me, and that I was getting my head around this non-drinking business. And, because life is going to happen. And so if you're going to pick up a drink, don't pick up a drink on a bad day. Do you know what I mean? Work on getting through that moment and that moment alone. Because if you want self-esteem, that's the moment that's going to give you self-esteem. You're not going to get self-esteem from reading a book. You're not going to get self-esteem from going for a pretty walk. You're going to get self-esteem from doing stuff that you don't believe you can do and doing it ugly. Because I can't grace through life prettily. I just can't, and never have done. But I've got my self-esteem today from actually just coping and just surviving things that I didn't believe I could do. And that, that's probably what it's taught me more than anything else. And I think AA taught me that, and the thru-hike enabled me to really put that to extreme, if you like.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.